It was the night of August 15, 1997, in the small, quiet town of OPP, Alabama, the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other, and people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. The Ramer home sat on a narrow street surrounded by tall pine trees, their shadows stretching long under the dim yellow porch lights. Inside, 17-year-old Kemberly Ramer, a bright and spirited high school senior, had just come home from visiting her boyfriend. It was around 10 p.m., and she slipped into her room after saying goodnight to her father, Ken Ramer, who lived just a few miles away but kept close contact with her. The air was still, heavy with the late summer humidity, and nothing seemed out of place. Yet, by morning, everything would change and the peaceful town of OPP would never be the same again. When investigators first arrived at the Ramer home, it looked disturbingly normal. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, and yet Kemberly was gone, vanished from her own bed. Her car keys, purse, and contact lenses were still on the dresser, as if she had planned to return any second. Her shoes were neatly placed by the bed, her bed covers slightly ruffled, and the faint smell of her shampoo still lingered in the air. The scene spoke of an interrupted night, a moment frozen between safety and something darkly unknown. The local police officers stood in silent disbelief, scanning the small bedroom illuminated by morning sunlight filtering through lace curtains. "It's like she just evaporated," one officer whispered. There was no struggle, no blood, nothing to suggest a violent abduction. But the eerie emptiness of that room told another story. Something had gone terribly wrong. Neighbors later recalled seeing nothing unusual that night. The street was dark, the town asleep, and the only sound had been the crickets and the distant hum of passing cars on the highway. Kemberly's stepmother had assumed she was still asleep that morning, not realizing hours had passed since she was last seen. It wasn't until her father came by later that day that the full horror began to sink in. The police taped off the small bedroom, marking the beginning of what would become one of Alabama's most haunting mysteries. As detectives combed through her room, every small detail began to feel significant: the unmade bed, the open closet door, the faint indentation on the carpet near the window. Was it her? Or had someone else been there, standing silently in the dark? Outside, news vans would soon line the street, and reporters whispered words like abduction, runaway, and mystery. But those who knew Kemberly best rejected the idea that she would ever leave on her own. She was responsible, loved by everyone, and had big dreams: college, a future, a life waiting ahead. As the morning sun rose higher, the small town began to buzz with fear. Parents started locking their doors, calling their daughters to check in, and watching the woods behind their homes a little more carefully. What happened inside that quiet room during those dark hours between night and morning would remain one of the most chilling unanswered questions in Alabama's history, a nightmare that began in the safest place of all, her own bed. The moment the realization hit that Kemberly Ramer was missing, OPP, Alabama, transformed from a peaceful small town into a community gripped by panic and disbelief.
Please, if you see anything,
it was
call the
Saturday
police.
morning,
Shannon,
August
we're heading
16,
south towards the highway. We'll find her.
1997. The Ramer household, once filled with laughter and the warmth of family routines, became a center of chaos and confusion. Ken Ramer, Kemberly's father, arrived early to check on his daughter, and when he opened her bedroom door, the silence hit him like a wall. Her bed was empty. The house was quiet, eerily too quiet. Her car still sat in the driveway. Her purse, driver's license, and contact lenses were untouched. Ken's voice trembled as he called out for her, but only his own echo answered back. In that moment, he knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. When Ken called the OPP police department, they initially suspected a runaway, a common assumption in missing teen cases. But those who knew Kemberly immediately dismissed the idea. She had no reason to run. She was a straight-A student, a former cheerleader, and a beloved daughter with plans to start college soon. She wasn't rebellious, she wasn't secretive, and she had a strong bond with both her parents. She wouldn't have just left, her best friend later told reporters through tears. Not without telling someone. Not without her car. Within hours, the tone shifted from casual concern to desperate urgency. The search for Kemberly Ramer had officially begun. The police launched their efforts with the help of volunteers, bloodhounds, and helicopters, scouring miles of dense woods and backroads surrounding OPP. The humid August air clung to every searcher as they trudged through the underbrush, calling her name again and again, Kemberly, Kemberly, hoping for any sign, any sound that might lead them to her. Local residents offered their land for searching. Others brought food, flashlights, and bottled water. It became a community effort fueled by fear and love. Even nearby towns sent volunteers, and the story began spreading across county lines, reaching the evening news. Her photo, a bright-eyed girl with a radiant smile, flashed on TV screens, followed by the chilling caption, "Missing, last seen in her own home." Investigators soon realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than a runaway case. Every piece of evidence, or lack thereof, told a story of a calculated abduction. There was no forced entry, no damage, no screams heard suggesting the person who took Kemberly might have been someone she knew and trusted. Perhaps someone who had been in her home before. That theory terrified the entire community, because it meant the threat could be close, maybe even living among them. The FBI was quickly called in, joining state investigators to assist local law enforcement. They collected fingerprints, shoe prints, and fiber samples, but none led to a suspect. It was as if the perpetrator had vanished just as completely as Kemberly had. As days turned into nights, the search grew heavier, both physically and emotionally. Posters with her face appeared on telephone poles, in grocery stores, and on car windows. Candlelight vigils were held at the local church. Her friends left flowers on her porch. Everyone prayed she would walk through her front door again. But each passing day without news deepened the dread. A week later, national media began covering the case, labeling it one of Alabama's most baffling disappearances. Still, there was no trace, no witnesses, no clues, no answers. For the Ramer family, time stopped on that August night. Every morning was just another reminder that their daughter had vanished into the dark, leaving behind a bedroom that looked almost exactly as she left it, neat, quiet, and unbearably empty. By the second week of Kemberly Ramer's disappearance, OPP, Alabama was no longer the sleepy town it once was.
She seemed fine.
Patrol cars idled on every street, strangers were questioned at gas stations, and investigators went door to door with photographs of the missing teen. What began as a small-town search had evolved into a full-scale criminal investigation involving the FBI, the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, and multiple county departments. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued, but each seemed to end the same way, in silence. The case was slipping through the cracks, and with every passing day, hope began to feel like sand falling through an open hand. Investigators started with the people closest to Kemberly. Her boyfriend, whom she had visited the night she vanished, was questioned extensively. He told police that she left his house around 10 p.m., heading straight home. His alibi was checked and confirmed. There was no sign of deception. Next came her family, her father, her stepmother, her mother who lived out of town. All were interviewed, their lives dissected in search of motive or secret. But there was nothing. Kemberly came from a loving, stable home. There were no signs of domestic tension, no history of running away, no enemies. She was popular, responsible, and well-liked, the kind of girl everyone described as the last person something like this would happen to. That made her disappearance even more chilling. If someone like Kemberly wasn't safe, who was? One of the most haunting parts of the investigation was how little physical evidence there was. Forensic teams found no fingerprints, no footprints, no blood, and no signs of a struggle. It was as though the kidnapper had entered and left without disturbing a single thing. Theories began to swirl. Had she been lured out by someone she trusted? Had she gone outside briefly and been taken before she could react? The window in her bedroom was examined closely, but nothing suggested an entry or exit through it. It's one of those cases where the absence of evidence is the evidence, one investigator later said. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Rumors began to spread through OPP like wildfire. Locals whispered about strange vehicles seen driving slowly through town that night. Others claimed to have heard noises, footsteps, or seen shadows near the Ramer property. But each tip led nowhere. False leads consumed valuable time and resources. Police searched nearby ponds, fields, and abandoned buildings, sometimes with the help of volunteers, sometimes with cadaver dogs. They drained sections of local creeks and searched through abandoned wells, desperate for any trace of the missing girl. Still, nothing. The emotional toll on the Ramer family was devastating. Ken Ramer appeared on local news stations, his voice cracking as he pleaded, "If someone has my daughter, please, I'm begging you, let her come home." He refused to believe she was gone forever, holding on to hope that she was alive somewhere, waiting to be found. But behind closed doors, the weight of uncertainty was crushing. Every ring of the phone sent a jolt of both hope and fear. Every lead raised expectations only to shatter them again. The once peaceful Ramer home had become a museum of grief, untouched bedroom, missing posters on the walls, and a silence that screamed louder than words. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to stall. There were no suspects, no witnesses, no physical evidence to hold on to. The only thing left was a question that echoed endlessly through the hearts of everyone in OPP: who took Kemberly Ramer, and why? The answers seemed buried somewhere in the darkness of that August night, hidden behind the silence of someone who knew exactly what they had done and was determined never to be caught. As the investigation stretched into its third month, OPP, Alabama, began to change in ways that would linger for years. The town that once prided itself on safety and neighborly trust had turned into a place of suspicion and fear. People locked their doors for the first time in decades. Children weren't allowed to walk to school alone anymore. At the local diner, where the same faces had gathered every morning for years, the only topic of conversation was Kemberly Ramer. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a suspicion. But no one had answers. The once peaceful rhythm of small-town life had been shattered by the silence left in the wake of one missing girl. Rumors began to swirl like wildfire, fueled by the media's growing attention and the lack of progress from law enforcement. Some whispered that Kemberly had been taken by someone she knew, perhaps a teacher, a family friend, or even someone from her church. Others speculated about strangers passing through town, drifters from the nearby highway, or someone who had watched her from afar. One theory even suggested a serial offender could be responsible, linking her disappearance to similar unsolved cases in surrounding counties. The police investigated every possible connection, but none panned out. Each theory dissolved into frustration and exhaustion, leaving only more questions in their wake. The pressure on investigators intensified. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was called in to develop a psychological profile of the potential abductor. Their findings were chilling. The profile suggested someone who was calm, intelligent, and methodical, a person who might live locally, who possibly knew Kemberly, and who could blend easily into the community. "He could be sitting right next to you," one agent warned during a town meeting. That sentence haunted people for months. Every friendly wave, every familiar smile suddenly carried the possibility of deceit. Neighbors began to look at each other differently. Trust, the backbone of OPP's small-town life, had fractured completely. Meanwhile, the Ramer family lived in emotional purgatory. Kemberly's father, Ken, was relentless. He organized search teams, met with investigators daily, and refused to let the case fade from public memory. Her mother, living in another part of Alabama, struggled with grief and guilt, blaming herself for not being there that night. They both appeared on local news stations and national programs, begging for leads. "Someone knows something," Ken said during one interview, his eyes red from sleepless nights. "If you're out there and you saw or heard anything, please don't be afraid. Speak up." But no one did. The silence was deafening. Theories began to drift into darker territory. Some people speculated that Kemberly had been taken for ransom, though no demands were ever made. Others whispered about human trafficking, a topic that was rarely discussed openly at the time. A few even believed she might have been taken and killed by a jealous acquaintance or rejected admirer. Investigators looked into every name mentioned, but the evidence never supported any single theory. There were too many possibilities, and none of them brought the case closer to resolution. As weeks turned to months, investigators began to face criticism. People accused the police of mishandling evidence, of missing early opportunities. Journalists questioned whether valuable time had been wasted treating the case as a runaway instead of an abduction. The lead investigator, exhausted and haunted, defended his team in a press conference, We have followed over 1,200 leads. We have spoken to hundreds of people. But until someone talks, or we find new evidence, we are fighting shadows. Those words hit hard, a grim reminder of how helpless even the most determined search could become when the truth refused to surface. By the end of the year, hope had begun to fade. Christmas lights went up around town, but for the Ramer family, there was nothing to celebrate. Her empty chair at the dinner table was a silent monument to the horror that had stolen their world. Outside, a light on their porch burned through every night, a signal that they hadn't given up, even when the rest of the world seemed to move on. And somewhere in the darkness, the person responsible, whoever they were, remained free, watching as the town tore itself apart searching for a ghost. By the time the year 2000 arrived, nearly 3 years after Kemberly Ramer's disappearance, OPP, Alabama, had learned to live with its wound, but it never truly healed. The posters had faded, the news coverage had slowed, and the once daily search efforts had turned into periodic revisits by detectives chasing the faintest of leads. The Ramer case had officially gone cold. Yet, for Ken Ramer and those closest to Kemberly, the passage of time brought no peace. Every birthday, every holiday, every new school year marked another painful reminder that she was still missing, still out there somewhere, perhaps alive, perhaps not, but always absent. Her room remained untouched, frozen in time. Her makeup sat on the dresser, her clothes still hung neatly in the closet, and the photos of her smiling with friends stared back like ghosts from a happier world. The investigators assigned to her case never fully gave up. Some retired, others transferred, but the file labeled Kemberly Ramer, missing person, always stayed on the active roster. Detectives periodically revisited evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and chased new tips that trickled in from all over the country. Most turned out to be dead ends, supposed sightings that led nowhere, confessions from attention seekers, rumors whispered by people desperate to feel involved in a story that had haunted their town. One detective described it best: "It's like chasing smoke. Every time we think we've caught something solid, it disappears right in front of us." Still, small pieces of hope surfaced from time to time. In 2001, investigators received a tip about a man who had allegedly bragged about knowing what happened to that Ramer girl. Police tracked him down, interrogated him, even searched his property, but again, there was no evidence to support his claim. A few years later, a similar case in Florida sparked renewed interest. A teenage girl had been abducted under eerily similar circumstances, no forced entry, taken from her bed at night. For a brief moment, detectives believed the cases could be connected. But DNA and other evidence quickly ruled that out. Each lead that failed brought a fresh wave of heartbreak for the Ramer family, reopening wounds that never closed. The emotional toll on Ken Ramer was devastating. He refused to leave OPP, refusing to move from the home that held his daughter's last known moments. "If she ever comes back," he once said, "she needs to come home and I need to be here waiting." He became an advocate for other families of missing persons, speaking at events and helping spread awareness about cold cases. His pain became his purpose. But no matter how strong he appeared in public, behind closed doors he was a man haunted. Friends recalled how he would sometimes sit alone on his porch late at night, staring into the darkness, as if waiting for a car to pull into the driveway that never came. As the years dragged on, Kemberly's name began to fade from national headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher mysteries. But in OPP, her face still hung on bulletin boards, in the police station, and on the wall of the local church. Every few years, the case was re-examined with new forensic technology, DNA analysis, fingerprint enhancements, and digital reconstructions, but each time, the results came back the same, inconclusive. The lack of evidence was maddening. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole, leaving behind no trace but pain. And yet, even in the face of despair, the Ramer family refused to let her memory die. Her friends, now grown, with families of their own, continued to hold candlelight vigils on the anniversary of her disappearance. They shared stories of her laughter, her kindness, her dreams. "She wasn't just a missing person," one of them said. "She was our friend, our sister, our classmate. And we'll never stop looking." Those vigils became sacred moments for the town, reminders that even after years of silence, hope was still alive, flickering like the candles they lit for her every August 15th. But beneath that hope was a lingering fear that whoever took Kemberly was still out there, living a normal life, blending into society as if nothing had ever happened. Maybe they passed through town from time to time. Maybe they even stood among the crowd during those vigils, watching from the shadows as people prayed for a girl they had buried in secrecy. That possibility was enough to keep the town's collective heart uneasy, a quiet dread that would never quite fade away. 2 decades after the disappearance of Kemberly Ramer, most people in OPP, Alabama, had come to believe they might never know what happened. Yet in 2012, nearly 15 years after that August night, the case suddenly roared back to life. A new generation of investigators joined the OPP Police Department, younger officers with fresh eyes, new technology, and the determination to revisit what their predecessors had left unresolved. Advances in forensic science, including updated DNA testing and digital evidence analysis, meant that even the smallest, most overlooked details from 1997 could now reveal information once thought impossible to uncover. For the first time in years, there was a ripple of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, the truth could still be found. The Cold Case Unit began by re-examining every piece of evidence collected from Kemberly's home. Old fibers, fingerprints, and photographs were resubmitted to modern labs capable of detecting microscopic traces of DNA. Investigators also re-interviewed dozens of people who had been part of the original investigation, from Kemberly's family to classmates to neighbors who had lived nearby. Many of them now had clearer memories, or were more willing to talk after years of reflection. The case file, once gathering dust on a shelf, was suddenly thick with new notes and new energy. The community, too, began to stir. For the first time in a long time, the name Kemberly Ramer appeared again on local news broadcasts, reigniting memories and emotions that had lain dormant for years. In the midst of this renewed effort, a chilling new development surfaced. Investigators received a tip linking a convicted offender, someone already imprisoned in Florida, to Kemberly's case. The man had a criminal history that matched certain aspects of the abduction profile: familiarity with the region, access to vehicles, and a pattern of targeting young women. The FBI and Alabama authorities coordinated interviews with the suspect, hoping for a confession or at least some clue. He denied any involvement, and no definitive physical evidence tied him to the scene, but his connection sparked widespread media attention. People across the state began following the case again, posting online, sharing theories, even forming small groups dedicated to investigating cold cases like Kemberly's. Social media became the new public square for amateur detectives determined to uncover what the official system hadn't. For the Ramer family, the renewed investigation was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it reignited the hope that had flickered for years. On the other, it reopened wounds they had tried so hard to heal. Ken Ramer, older now but still strong in spirit, once again found himself surrounded by flashing cameras and reporters asking painful questions. "I've waited half my life for answers," he said softly during a 2012 press conference. "If this brings her home, no matter how, I'll finally be able to breathe." His words resonated deeply, echoing the unspoken pain of every parent who has ever lost a child to the unknown. The investigation expanded even further in 2014, when a specialized FBI task force joined the search. Using geographic profiling software and new data analysis methods, they began mapping out likely abduction routes, identifying potential burial sites, and cross-referencing similar cases across multiple states. Search teams returned to areas that had already been combed in the late 1990s, this time equipped with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained to detect remains decades old. Several rural properties were searched, wells, wooded areas, abandoned sheds, but each time, they came up empty. Still, the renewed focus meant that the story was alive again, refusing to vanish into the archives. And then came the rumors. Local media outlets began reporting that investigators were close to a breakthrough. Some claimed there was new physical evidence, others hinted at a possible confession from an incarcerated man. But when the press pressed for confirmation, law enforcement remained tight-lipped. The secrecy only fueled speculation. People whispered about hidden evidence, a cover-up, or even corruption from the early investigation. Theories that had long faded returned to public consciousness, reigniting debates in diners, churches, and online forums. Once again, OPP was caught between hope and hysteria, the same emotional storm it had endured back in 1997. As of that time, nothing definitive had been proven, but something about the renewed energy felt different. Detectives weren't just looking at the facts anymore, they were listening to the emotion in the case, the human side of the story. Kemberly wasn't a file or a cold statistic, she was a daughter, a friend, a young woman whose life was stolen far too soon. That understanding brought a depth of empathy to the new investigation that had been missing before. It also reminded the people of OPP that while time may bury clues, it can't erase the truth, and one day, that truth would come for whoever had taken Kemberly from her bed all those years ago. By 2015, nearly 18 years after Kemberly Ramer's disappearance, whispers began circulating that investigators had zeroed in on a person of interest. His name wasn't released publicly at first, but behind the scenes, the tension in OPP was palpable. Detectives were chasing what they called a pattern of proximity, a man who had lived not far from the Ramer home at the time of Kemberly's abduction, someone with a history of violent behavior, and a string of troubling connections to other young women in the area. He wasn't a stranger to the Ramer family. In fact, he had occasionally crossed paths with them through mutual acquaintances. That single detail, that he might have been someone she knew, brought the case full circle, aligning eerily with what investigators had theorized all along. Kemberly's abductor wasn't an outsider. He was one of them. The man in question, whose identity eventually leaked through unofficial sources, had a criminal record involving assault and kidnapping attempts in neighboring counties. He had served time in Florida for unrelated offenses and was already behind bars when the cold case unit reopened Kemberly's file. Investigators secured search warrants for his former residences, combing through old properties, vehicles, and stored belongings. They collected items like ropes, clothing, and handwritten notes, some dating back to the late 1990s. Forensic teams meticulously examined them using modern DNA testing methods unavailable during the original investigation. The results were promising but inconclusive. Traces of female DNA were detected, but contamination and degradation over time prevented positive identification. Still, the pattern of behavior, location, and timing was too coincidental to ignore. Public speculation exploded. News outlets from Alabama to Florida began running nightly segments with headlines like "New Break in the Ramer Case," and "Possible Suspect Identified After 18 Years." Social media lit up with theories, names, and speculation, some helpful, others reckless. The renewed attention drew national true crime shows, podcasters, and documentarians eager to tell Kemberly's story. It became part of a growing wave of cold case reinvestigations that captivated America's fascination with unsolved mysteries. But while public curiosity surged, investigators remained cautious. Without a confession or definitive DNA match, there was still no legal ground for an arrest. They knew that rushing to judgment could destroy the fragile progress they had made. So, they waited, quietly, patiently, for the right moment. Then came a twist that shook even the most seasoned detectives. During an interview with investigators, the suspect, now in his 50s, made vague, unsettling remarks about the things he'd done in his younger years. He didn't mention Kemberly by name, but his tone, his phrasing, and his timeline aligned perfectly with the period of her disappearance. One detective later recalled, "He wasn't confessing, but he wanted us to know he could have. It was like he was taunting us." Despite the chilling implications, the comments weren't enough to press charges. Without hard evidence, law enforcement's hands were tied. But they kept the man under close surveillance, monitoring his communications, rechecking travel records, and interviewing anyone who had known him back in 1997. Slowly, a web began to emerge, a pattern of movements and behaviors that eerily mirrored the night Kemberly vanished. As investigators dug deeper, more unsettling connections surfaced. Several women from the late 1990s and early 2000s reported encounters with a man who matched his description, someone who had followed them, harassed them, or tried to lure them into his vehicle. Some of these incidents occurred within 20 miles of OPP. Each account added another layer to the growing belief that the same predator who had taken Kemberly might have been active for years, hiding in plain sight. Detectives began to suspect that her case wasn't just an isolated tragedy, it was part of a broader pattern of predation that had gone unchecked for decades. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on the Ramer family deepened once again. The thought that her killer might still be alive, still breathing, and perhaps even free at some point, reopened old wounds that had barely scarred over. Ken Ramer, now older and visibly worn from years of heartbreak, told reporters, "I don't want revenge. I just want peace. I just want my daughter found." His words broke hearts across Alabama, resonating with every parent who had ever feared the unthinkable. Candlelight vigils turned into rallies for justice, and the once quiet case became a symbol of perseverance for families of missing persons everywhere. But still, no body, no confession, no closure. It was as though the answers sat just beneath the surface, buried under layers of silence, waiting for the right break to shatter it all. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, OPP was holding its breath again. The truth was closer than ever, and everyone could feel it.